Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to be talking to parents about this issue of wireless and children's health and what you need to know about the recent lawsuit, which we won against the FCC, and what it means for parents, for families, and what you can do. So I am a Montgomery County resident, and I know a lot of people on this call are familiar with this issue, but I see some new people as well. So do put your questions in the chat as we go along, and I want to answer your questions related to the lawsuit or any other questions that you have. So I started off with this slide. I'm sorry, let me move this bar over. I'll just get up the chat there. Okay, great. So when I first became interested in this issue, I'd actually seen it was like a news piece that came, I think it was on NPR, about the impact to children's brains from cell phones and wireless. And I assumed at that time that what I have here as a myth, that the US health agencies have systematically reviewed the totality of the science and found cell phones, Wi-Fi, and cell towers to be perfectly safe. Of course, if they're on the market, they have to be safe. I mean, surely they wouldn't be sold to us, be on the laps now of children if they weren't known to be safe. And this picture shocks me, but all you have to do is walk outside or be in any grocery store. And the babies, toddlers, but babies have cell phones. They're handed cell phones as toys, and it seems like the next best thing. What our lawsuit really opened up was kind of took the covers off the reality that there's been no review. There was no pre-market safety testing for cell phones and wireless radiation. There's been no post-market surveillance, and there isn't really anyone on the job of ensuring that this radiation is safe by systematically looking at all of the science and coming to conclusions and doing risk assessments and ensuring safety for the public. So here's a, whoops, I'm fussing with that, sorry about that. Here's a cell tower above homes, actually above a kid's playground. And there has not been any systematic review of all the science, not to looking at children's vulnerability, not looking at impacts to the impacts to the brain or impacts to your immune system or to brain development. And there have been thousands of studies that have found harmful effects at very low levels, at levels where you simply shouldn't have seen harm, at levels that our FCC limits consider safe. So what am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about wireless radiation, everything from the laptops that are on Wi-Fi and our babies, again, are exposed, cell phones, these virtual speakers, which are right by the beds of many families, from wireless video games that kids are playing, and iPads. And if you go around your house, there's this time in this world, so many devices, from smart lights to smart TVs, not just your cell phone. This is not just about our cell phone anymore. Wireless MP3 players, I'm sure you remember when they were simply not wireless, but now everything is wireless. Video games, smartwatches, wireless keyboard, wireless peripherals, Bluetooth, a Wi-Fi. Outside your window, there might be a cell tower. And if you live in Montgomery County, there can be cell antennas within 30 feet. No notice, no hearing. That's CTA 1907. So, oh, and your home cordless phone. I don't want to forget about that. But home cordless phones also emit wireless radiation, similar to your cell phone and to your Wi-Fi router. There's also wireless printers and everything wireless emits radio frequency radiation, and that is absorbed into the bodies of whoever's near those devices. And if there's a cell tower near you, or even not as close where you can see it, but near you, you can be receiving that radio frequency into your body. Now, kind of briefly, before I talk about the case, because this is a part of our lawsuit, I want to explain how antiquated the rules are about how we test this radiation. So there is no pre-market safety testing for long-term safety. There was not for cell phones before they came on the market. But what they do is when a phone comes on the market, they have to test. You take one phone and you make sure that it meets these limits, which were set in 1996. And the way they do that is what you're looking at is it's a kind of a almost plastic, not quite plastic, fiber, a head made of a certain kind of material, phantom. And inside is a liquid, sugar liquid, a special liquid. Depending on the frequency, they put a different liquid in. It's a thick liquid. And then this is the thermometer that goes in the head. And this is the phone. And they put this thermometer in with the phone transmitting in certain positions. This is the position going this way. You can see that the edge and this edge are not touching the head. And actually there's an ear. You can't see it, but there's a little slab that represents the ear that keeps a space between the head and the phone. And this is taking the temperature to make sure that the temperature inside the head, the plastic dummy, does not increase a certain amount, which is part of the limits that we have for the FCC. I'm not going to go into details into this unless you want me to. I'm glad to go into deep details, but it's a certain level that the heat can go to in this plastic head in liquid. Now, this is based on the way that the FCC set these limits. Actually, they adopted limits based on industry-filled groups. Were based on animal studies done in the 60s and 70s, where they heated the animals up with microwave radiation. And when the animals stopped pressing a lever for food, they determined that was the level that there was a behavioral effect. And they said, that's the level, and we're going to set limits based on this being the harmful effect, that the animals didn't continue searching for food. So, long story short, this is how we test phones. We do not test them touching the body. I'm going to show you a little bit more about that. But really importantly, this is a big head. This is not a child's head. This is an adult head. It actually represents a man at very large Marine, one of the bigger, stronger Marines, because these limits, our FCC limits, were based on protecting our military and radar when they were first developed. It's an adult man, not a child. Now, here is how we test for the body as well. You see this part here. You go underneath, you put the phone underneath with a spacer between the phone and the phantom in this liquid. And again, take a temperature to make sure that the temperature doesn't exceed the limits. So in our lawsuit against the FCC, we put on the FCC record the information documenting how the limits that we have that are based on heat only do not protect humans or the environment. First, they're based on heat and not biological effects. There are thousands of studies showing effects at levels which are not about heat. It's not about when you microwave your food. It's not about how hot it gets. It's about other biochemical changes, especially biochemical changes that can happen over time, that can, like a domino effect, or like in a cascading effect, our bodies, also the bodies of animals, trees, birds, and bees. Also, the research that's been used for these limits were based on adults, adult man, not children, and their unique vulnerability, which I'm going to talk about. They didn't consider impacts during pregnancy. You know, women are taking the phone and resting it on their abdomen and the laptops on their abdomen. Did anyone look at that? Did anyone look at how the development of the fetus would be altered by all of this exposure? Of course, children have thinner skulls, and they also are more electrically conductive. Mammals, young mammals, have more liquid, they have more conductive tissues, actually. So they're not just smaller adults. They actually absorb the radiation deeper into their bodies. It penetrates into deeper into brain centers and at more intense levels. And of course, the way that we use devices now in 2021 is totally different than we did in 1996 when the limits were set. We remember phones used to be in holsters. However, and they still test phones as if they are in holsters with a space between the phone and the body. Phones are not tested in your bra. They're not tested in your spandex pants. They're not tested in your shirt pocket or your pants pocket or your back pants pocket. That is not how phones are tested. They're tested with a space between the phone and the body, actually, in the body. And they certainly don't consider effects on trees, birds, bees, or wildlife. They never were intended to. And yet we are proliferating all of these new cell towers in communities for 5G and the Internet of Things. Or at least that's what we're being marketed, because they're not really bringing 5G in, they're really bringing 4G in. So as a short history of how this happened, for many years, for decades, the United States and several agencies in the United States were robustly funding research into the issue of non-ionizing radiation and wireless radiation. They were experimenting on animals and writing reports and reviewing the science. Quite a robust research program after the Cold War. So was Russia, actually, which if you're interested, I can talk about that. And please put questions in the chat as we're talking, because that way I can integrate that as I'm talking and also just directly answer them. The EPA was defunded from developing safety standards, actually starting in the end of the 80s. And then from 1995 to 1996, it was completely cut off, the funding, due to heavy lobbying by the wireless industry. At the same time, the Telecom Act was passed, and the FCC adopted limits for how much radiation we could absorb from Wi-Fi, wireless, cell phones. Of course, Wi-Fi wasn't even really around then, but any kind of wireless. And we adopted limits, the US government, based on industry-funded groups' recommendations, as I talked about. Now, those limits have not changed since 1996. There's been no review of those limits. And what happened was the FCC, after a GAO report reported that the limits might not reflect current science and should be reassessed in 2012, the FCC opened a notice of inquiry on these limits. Now, that does not mean they reviewed the limits. That means they asked the question, should the limits be reviewed? They opened a notice of inquiry, they opened a record, and people submitted to that record. In 2019, and thousands, I should say, thousands of submissions are on the record, and it's really over 10,000, it's really over 14,000 pages of science recommendations, mostly recommendations to change these limits, with some of industry putting their submissions on as well. But there's this huge record with all this information. And then in 2019, the FCC terminated their notice of inquiry and said, we've looked at the record and there's no reason to change our limits from 1996. We're not going to do a review, and that's it. So that's when we filed our legal appeal challenging the FCC's refusal to update, to review, have a formal review on the radio frequency radiation limits, along with several other groups, Consumer for Safe Cell Phones and Children's Health Defense, and a total of 14 petitioners, actually, some doctors as well. The ruling in our case came in August with the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, second most important federal court in the land in the United States. And they ruled that the FCC decision was arbitrary and capricious based on the FCC's complete refusal to even completely ignored the science on the environment, completely ignored all of this documentation of harm to flora and fauna. And also, they didn't explain why they made their decision in terms of long-term health effects, in terms of children's vulnerability, in terms of all of the people who have documented that they've been injured by wireless radiation. They have brain tumors or they develop sensitivities and they're not able to get accommodated because they're told that this is within FCC limits. I don't have to reduce exposure for you. So I talked about this. The court found they didn't provide that evidence. And a few things about the decision I wanted to point out. And you can put your questions in the chat, or you can even raise your hand. I think I can figure out how to have people ask questions live as well, if you'd like, or put it in the Q&A. Some of the things that came out in the case that are really so important is that there's been no systematic review by any U.S. federal health or safety agency on all of the science. There was not submissions where the agencies that you would think would have something to say submitted an opinion. There weren't submissions from the Department of Labor with an opinion. All the Department of Labor did is say, this is very important, and we think that you should really look into this, but we are not studying this issue. And also they recommended that the FCC ask the National Toxicology Program its thoughts because it was studying this issue of non-thermal effects. The FCC didn't follow up on that. The EPA actually submitted less than a paragraph of nothing. It wasn't an opinion. It just was like we're glad you're doing this kind of thing. Same with the National Cancer Institute and same with the National Toxicology Program. The NCI and NTP's submission was many years ago, actually, just saying, we're glad you're doing this, but not saying, here's what we think. Here's what we think of the limits. Here's what we think of the science. We've looked at this, we've looked at that. The FDA put in I guess it's about 2-page letter, but it had only one paragraph on this issue, basically saying, yeah, well, the National Toxicology Program study really didn't give us anything that makes us think we should change the limits, even though it found clear evidence of cancer. They didn't say this, but it found clear evidence of cancer and DNA damage. And so, we don't see any reason on our end to make a change to the limits. Upon getting that FDA, what the court calls cursory statement, the FCC made that determination. But what the court said was, the silence of other expert agencies does not constitute a reasoned explanation, because the FCC said, well, the sister agencies didn't say anything. They didn't say that there was a problem, so we're good to go with our limits. Of course, the story is that the EPA was defunded, that there aren't scientists working on this issue in our federal health and safety agencies, looking at all the research. And the court said silence does not even indicate whether the expert agencies made any such determination or whether they considered any of the evidence on the record. Now you can go online to Environmental Health Trust at ehtrust.org and please listen to the oral argument where you hear the judge ask questions of the FCC. And there are all these moments where so many of them. In fact, I did a whole video. If you want to watch my video where I kind of pick out the really important parts and highlight and talk about them. So there's really 2 videos. And then the third video I'd recommend, if you're interested, is our press conference that we had after we got the ruling in the case. So where we had Dr. Hugh Taylor, chief of OBGYN at Yale. We have Frank Clegg, former Microsoft Canada president, who was working on this issue. and he's based in Canada, and he's working on Canadians for safe technology. So, so it really broke open the issue. As I talked about, children absorb cell phone radiation deeper into their brains. But more than that, they have developing brains. So their brains are more vulnerable and more sensitive to wireless radiation. And here is an example. This is actually a simulation. This is not just using Photoshop to make a colorful image, but it's kind of like a heat map that engineers put together with state-of-the-art computers to show the electric field and how it penetrates into the different tissues of the body. And this is the microwave absorption into a 6-year-old child from a cell phone to the ear, showing the field propagating in space and as well going into, if you could slice your head, they actually do all these slices, and they can see at any one point in the brain, in the skull, and the different tissues, what is the intensity of the field from the wireless radiation. And this is referencing several studies actually, but Fernandez 2018 found the younger models, the younger simulations of the younger child show higher absorption rates and exposures than the adult model. And as is stated by the American Academy of Pediatrics, which sent several letters to the FCC and the FDA on this over the years, the radio frequency energy deposition is 2 times into a child's brain and 10 times higher in the skull and the bone marrow in children compared to adults. And one of the areas that the FCC completely ignored that was pointed out by the court was the impacts to the developing brain. There is research showing decreased and damaged brain cells in animals exposed as adults and prenatally, altered brain activity that's an NIH study that found changes in the brain closest to the cell phone antenna. Decreased memory in teens has been found in a study out of Switzerland where they replicated prior work and actually really worked on addressing some of the limitations of the earlier study and found a change after 1 year in teenagers in terms of tests they did related to memory. And those tests were directly related to the part of the brain that would receive the most radiation. And they found in the teenagers that used the phone to their head, on one side of their head, related to that specific memory test, that they had damaged memory. And of course, if you've heard us talk before, there's the Yale study led by Dr. Hugh Taylor, chief of obstetrics at Yale, that found decreased memory and hyperactivity after prenatal exposure in mice. There's research showing behavioral problems in human children and human children when the mothers had heavier cell phone radiation exposure, and as well as postnatally too. And hyperactivity and inattention in children after prenatal exposure. There's also research showing a possible synergistic effect where kids who had higher blood lead levels also had higher cell phone radiation exposure had more ADHD compared to kids who didn't have either of those. And there's actually a real growing body of literature showing synergies, combinations of effects. Now, there were several amicus briefs in our case. All of them are I'm just so thankful for them. NRDC did a piece on the need for environmental review. One was a amicus by a telecom attorney, actually Joe Sandry, that had a declaration by Dr. Linda Birnbaum. And in her declaration, she talks about the importance of the National Toxicology Program study that found clear evidence of cancer in the male rats. The FDA is saying that study is not important and doesn't apply to humans. And what it means is that our limits are fine. And she details how they do demonstrate the potential for radiofrequency radiation to cause cancer in humans. Doesn't mean there's a direct, the exposure to the rats, the effect on the rats is going to be exactly the exposure to the humans and the same effect. You actually have to do a risk analysis to come up with what does it mean for humans. But when you think about how widespread our exposure is, the effect can be quite great. And she has an amicus brief on that. I talked about the American Academy of Pediatrics that submitted to the FCC, and their letter was ignored, not even referenced. But I'd like to point out to everyone who's listening the great op-ed that was published by Dr. Jerome Paulson in Maryland Matters, where that's about the Montgomery County ZTA 1907 that was rushed through and passed that allows cell towers 30 feet from the home. And what I have here is some quotes from the that he gave for the press release that we had, the press release after the court date. I'm very pleased to see the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit that has ruled that the Federal Communications Commission can no longer ignore decades of studies on cell phone radiation, amassed since 1996, the year that the FCC set safety limits for cell phones and cell towers. And Dr. Jerome Paulson is at George Washington University, but former chair of the American Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Environmental Health, and a very esteemed environmental health physician. And he has been working on all kinds of toxins and just done such great work. And I'm so thankful for what he's done in relationship to wireless, as well as plastics and chemicals and all kinds of environmental health issues. If you want to learn more about the National Toxicology Program, please go to the National Toxicology Program webpage, where they have information on their cell phone radiation studies. The FDA asked for this study, and it was designed by Dr. Ronald Melnick and his team in order to determine are the limits that we have based on heat, are they safe? Is heat the only harm? Is heat the only harm? And they found clear evidence of tumors in the hearts of male rats, some evidence of tumors in the brains of male rats, and in the adrenal glands of male rats in a certain group. And they also found in the genotoxic studies, they actually took mice and rats. The study was a 2-year study. Rodents live about 3 years, but at 2 years they sacrificed them. But some of them they pulled out early and took a look at them in terms of DNA damage. And they found DNA damage in the frontal cortex of the brain in male mice, the blood cells of female mice, and the hippocampus of male rats. And they simply should not have found anything if this radiation was safe, because it was not the levels of the exposure to the animals were at or only slightly higher than what's allowed from a cell tower to your head, the intensities to the tissue right near the phone. They specifically chose those limits, the levels of exposure, to see in any part of the body and all the organs that were exposed to that level, would we see an increase in cancer or anything else from that intensity that we allow to the head. And this is Dr. Ronald Melnick, who I spoke about, retired after 28 years at NIH, who led the design of this study. This is just the end of his longer talk about what the finding means for the public and also what he recommends. So,
what does the public need to know?
Wait, let me start this again.
Found increases in cancer. What does the public need to know? There have been multiple studies have found increases in cancer associated with exposure to radiofrequency radiation. This is animals and humans. Because of the widespread use of cell phones, even a small increase in cancer risk would have a serious public health impact. I strongly feel precautionary principles should be promoted by health and regulatory agencies, especially for children and pregnant women. The agencies in the US say, if you are concerned, that puts the burden on the individual. It doesn't say, we are concerned. It should be very straightforward. Precautionary principles should be promoted because, as mentioned earlier, risk can be greater for children than adults due to the increased penetration of the radiation within brains of children, and the developing nervous system is more susceptible to tissue damaging agents. So finally, what is the lesson that should be learned? When dealing with assumptions, I think we've shown that assumptions in this case can be wrong, so that we should no longer assume that any current or future wireless technology, including 5G, is safe without adequate testing. Thank you.
And you can go online and watch, you can search Ronald Melnick on our YouTube channel, where we try to put talks that he's given, that he has technical talks on the NTP study and what it means. So thankful that he is really speaking out on this. It seems that when one is retired, there's a lot more to say. And unfortunately, in the agencies that we assume will protect us, like the CDC or NCI, they are more concerned about this issue as a public relations issue rather than a public safety issue. So Christopher Portier used to be the director of the United States National Center for Environmental Health at the CDC. He also represented the US CDC at the World Health Organization International Agency for Research on Cancer working group meeting that happened back in 2011, when they made the determination that wireless radiation was a possible carcinogen. Now, since then, that's about, oh my gosh, it's been a decade. I guess here we are, it's 2021. That was 10 years ago that they decided it was a possible carcinogen. And they made that determination because there was not enough animal evidence, but the NTP study provides animal evidence. And he now has written a report saying that the probability that radiofrequency radiation causes gliomas and neuromas is high. And you can go online to read that as well. That's Chris Portier. So the court ordered the FCC to provide a reasoned explanation for its decision to keep its testing procedures and for determining whether cell phones and other portable devices comply with its guidelines. Because actually, when phones are tested the way we use them, touching the body, they exceed FCC limits. And to address the impacts of RF radiation on children, the health implications of long-term exposure, and the ubiquity of wireless devices, and the technological developments that have occurred since the commission last updated its guidelines. And they also ordered the court to address the impacts of radiofrequency radiation on the environment. Now, there are many studies that have been published, and I'll put a link in the chat so you can see just a small sampling of the studies that have been published since the FCC closed its inquiry and made its determination that there was no reason to change the limits. But the Environmental Working Group published a very important paper. They analyzed the NTP data, the cancers in the rats, as well as there was actually heart damage in male and female rat groups as well. And they looked at that. They used risk assessment guidelines that are used for toxic agents. And they determined that the FCC limits were 200 to 400 times too high to protect children. And that study is published, and very important study that was published this year, that you can find online by Environmental Working Group. You can go to Environmental Working Group and look up their press release as well. There's also an important study published by Yale researchers funded by the American Cancer Society that found that in people who use cell phones close to their head, if they had a certain, it's a certain genetic SNP, a genetic kind of like us, it would be a susceptibility, but it's a common, actually, genetic variant, that they had higher thyroid cancer for those who use the phone more. And that study was not included in the NTP, in the FCC determination. Here's some imaging showing the penetration into a child from a tablet. And again, this is the colors represent the intensity, and you see the eyes, and the front of the head if the tablet was right here. This is showing the wave. This doesn't mean it stops here. This is just showing how the wave propagates off the antenna into the air. And the lighter colors are the higher intensities absorbed. This is a simulation showing a cell phone in a pocket. And if you took a slice to see where is it being absorbed, it is highly absorbed into reproductive organs, into that area. And this is actually, I didn't mean to have this here, but a study that looked at impacts from wireless radiation to the development of the testes, and showed changes in the cell walls of testes. It's different than the pants and the body. Two separate studies. One, this is a absorption study looking at the absorption of the field, and this is one of many studies looking at impacts to the reproductive organs. Of course, there have been hundreds of scientists who are appealing the deployment of 5G, and also recommending that companies that countries take action to halt 5G, to protect the public by reducing exposure rather than increasing exposure. The International Society of Doctors for the Environment, over 400, actually it's 415 now, scientists who've signed on to the 5G appeal, the EMF scientists appeal, the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments, the German doctors delegation, Belgian doctors, the Pan-Cyprian Medical Organization, that's the Vienna Medical Association, the Cyprus Medical Association, the Athens Medical Association. There's an appeal to stop 5G on Earth and space. And most recently, there was signed by thousands, organizations representing thousands of doctors, the international appeal out of the United Kingdom. And I also would recommend, for those of you who are on the call and haven't kept up because of everything going on, that the European Parliament released a report on the health impact of 5G, finding that the commonly used radio frequencies that have been used in 2G and 3G are probably carcinogenic for humans based on the human data, the animal data, and the cell data. And when it comes to fertility, it clearly affects male fertility with possible adverse effects on the development of embryos, fetuses, and newborns. For the higher frequencies, they found there's an inadequate research base to make a determination one way or the other. Because of course, we're rolling out 5G with these higher frequencies and have not adequately tested them for safety. There is science on these higher frequencies showing impacts to bees and insects that's going to be unique, impacts to the skin, impacts to bacteria. It is not that there is not science, actually, but not enough as we have on the lower frequencies. And we haven't tested it for long-term exposure. We haven't taken animals and exposed them for years to the high frequencies that will be used in 5G. So there are so many technologies, solutions that exist. We can prioritize safer Ethernet and fiber optic connections, so we don't have to have everything wireless all the time. I have a picture of a seatbelt because it's just like cars with seatbelts. It's like we're rolling out this technology without the safety measures in place and without the review of whether we need and what we need for safety measures. Would you drive in a car that had airbags and seatbelts that hadn't been really looked at for 25 years, or where the experts in car safety hadn't reviewed the issue for 25 years? So we need seatbelts and airbags on our technology. And there's so much we can do. Like right now, I'm talking to you through a wired connection. There can be research and design by industry to make safer products that emit less wireless radiation, but really emit no radiation and allow you to connect without having to have it always be wireless. There are hardware and software changes that can reduce radio frequency radiation. Right now, it is so hard to even buy technology that isn't wireless. It's unacceptable, especially if, like me, I'm in the same place all the time, and I certainly don't need everything to be wireless. I have Ethernet I can connect to. So in schools, there are a lot of options for hardwiring that people are instead choosing everything to be wireless, even though in colleges, they used to have Ethernet set up in conference rooms. Is that my husband? Okay. So we can do this, but we need public pressure. We need the companies really to have the pressure from the government to have them make these things safer, just like with cars, just like with any other corporations that are producing products. There needs to be oversight on the issue. And right now we don't even have oversight. We don't have scientists even looking at all of the science. Here's an example of a tablet. A child came over my house using Minecraft. I'm not going to talk about social media and addiction to devices right now, although I could, because companies know these devices are addictive, part of our problem. But here he is on doing what he's doing on a tablet, on a wire. This is actually a special adapter and just doesn't need to be wireless. In France, there's an order that when you buy cell phones, that it says, keep the equipment away from the belly of pregnant women, keep it away from the lower abdomen of adolescents. And yet this image is from Baltimore schools, actually, where they were promoting their wireless technology program. We have these devices on laps. Here's my computer connected by a wire. I have an Ethernet cord, I have the adapter, and this is what I'm doing right now with you. And I have super fast internet. The New Hampshire State Commission on 5G and environmental health, actually, and environmental health effects, issued a report with 15 recommendations after a year of research, recommending, really every recommendation is super important, but you can go online to read all of them, but wired instead of Wi-Fi in schools, radio frequency radiation free zones in commercial and public buildings, including schools, health agencies to educate the public on minimizing radio frequency radiation with a multimedia public relations campaign, especially for pregnant women and babies, and that there should be cell tower setbacks for schools and homes. Here is an example of, I was at a hotel near my daughter's college, and they had the old school. They had an Ethernet plug to plug in. This is the hotel I go to because I can plug into Ethernet. Most hotels, most places don't offer this, but there it was there. We know how to do it. If you're in a hotel room, you're not going to be running around the hotel room that's as big as, some people's bathrooms. It can be plugged in with the wire, your laptop, which is on the only table in the entire room. In Maryland, the Maryland State Children's Environmental Health Protection Advisory Council issued a report recommending reducing Wi-Fi in schools. And they recommend as much as feasibly possible using wire devices in classrooms. If a new classroom is to be built, network cables can be added, providing wired access. Most people in Maryland don't know that. Here's an example of the back of a bus in Cyprus. Here's the translation of what it's saying. Don't irradiate me. Learn how to protect me. The radiation is possibly carcinogenic. And they have a flyer about how you can reduce exposure for people. And that is with the Cyprus Committee on the Environment and Children's Health in collaboration with the Cyprus Office of Health. Actually, I have it cut off, I'm sorry. In Cyprus, the Archbishop Makarios Hospital also removed Wi-Fi from pediatric and neonatal units, and they actually showed in their testing that the radiation is reduced They also educate the parents on this issue in order to support healthier recovery for children. There are actually many laws around the world. This is not all of them. This is just some examples of them where they are having more transparency. They are calling for protections for kids. They have Wi-Fi removed from daycares and elementary schools. They have labeling on cell phones. So there's a lot that can be done, so much that can be done when there is oversight. And what our lawsuit really broke open is that in the United States, everyone thinks, as I said at the beginning of this, going back to this slide, we believe that U.S. health agencies have systematically reviewed the totality of the science and found cell phones, Wi-Fi, and cell towers are safe. And really, there's been no review, there's been no update. These limits were set in 1996. They haven't changed since then. Whereas in other countries like Belgium, they banned the sale of mobile phones designed for children because of the radiation. So please put questions in the chat if you have some, and I can show you a few more slides too. Or if you want to ask a question, please do. Okay, so in Montgomery County, okay, there's a question about Montgomery County. We, a really incredible group of residents in Montgomery County have been working for years on this issue. And there was a proposal to put cell towers close to homes. It was stopped for 4 years. And then in the 5th year, right after the pandemic, it was pushed through. Most people are completely unaware that this zoning amendment, ZTA 1907, was even on the table. It was passed. It allows cell towers, small cell towers, 5G or 4G small cells within 30 feet of homes. Actually, it can go even closer if the hearing examiner determines that it's needed. And that means on your light pole, on your street light, that can be replaced with a stronger pole and be actually a short cell tower. And that is something that we're really working on. So if you're on the call and you want to know what can I do, please join our Action Network letter writing campaign to Montgomery County Council. We are calling for a reversal of this ZTA. Please contact and meet with your elected officials on this and ask them to stop it, because we have to amend the amendment. That's ultimately what has to happen in Montgomery County. Talk to your federal officials as well, and your state, because at the state level, very likely there's going to be a bill that's coming forward that's going to strip away local authority, making it even easier for companies to put cell antennas in our front yards. So, and at the federal level, we really need protections because, so what's up next with our case? I should talk about the case. It's been remanded back to the FCC. That just happened last week. The FCC has some choices. They could, and we fully expect them to want to do the following. They could hire a contractor or themselves, write up with more words why they think our FCC limits are adequate. And they could put that forward to the court, and that could be determined to be adequate because they might talk about impacts to birds, bees, and trees. They might talk about the impacts to the brain or impacts to the reproductive system. And the court is not making a scientific determination. They're only determining, did you show that you looked at the issue? So if they do that, that is not going to be good, actually, because what we want the FCC to do is to really solicit and get actual opinions from the Environmental Protection Agency, a true risk assessment, a true look at what are the impacts to bees, birds, and trees. And we want them to look at what are the impacts to human health and non-cancer issues. Now, on the cancer issue, we want them to relook at the issue because they just went with the FDA determination. And the FDA has put forward numerous misleading statements on their website. You can look up cell tower radiation FDA and see what I mean. They talk about the NTP study without even describing what the NTP study found. What is that? They say they looked at the totality of the research, but actually they have not. They only have a literature review that looks at just cancer, dismisses every study that found an effect. What is that? Is that acceptable? Where is the real look at the cancer data as well as impacts to brain and reproduction for humans that the FDA should be doing? Are they regularly monitoring the science? There have been a lot of studies that have come out that haven't been looked at by the FDA in any way that we know of. They haven't shown they've looked at it by putting out any review and so forth. So there's a lot that has to be done. Plus the EPA, we want the EPA to be involved. So for that to happen, the FCC needs to, we believe, refresh the record. Refresh the record means they need to reopen their record to get science since 2019 and solicit in a meaningful way a response from the EPA, from the FDA, related to all of these other issues that weren't addressed. So when that's done, there can be a real hard look at what's gone on, and rather than just saying everything's fine, no problem here. So we are calling on our elected officials at the federal level to actually write the FCC and to ask for a record refresh. Because if they don't do that, they actually can just put forward something that has the words in there, but doesn't actually have a review by our federal agencies and doesn't have the up-to-date science. We really need that. And if you have some questions about that, please let me know. I know some of you on the call are working on this, but that's what we need you to do now, is contact the federal officials on that issue. So let's see, what are some people doing related to cell towers and 5G? Let me get this back. Okay. So just as one example, around the world, there are many countries that are not ignoring the problem as we are. Now, they're not perfect, and actually there's a lot that needs to be done, but compared to the United States, while we have our court case, which is a huge landmark victory, other than that, other countries are just light years ahead of us, as I showed you a few examples. But when it comes to 5G and cell towers, there are resolutions to halt 5G in several cities in Europe, 600 in Italy alone. 600 in Italy alone. Hard to believe, but yes. Whereas in the United States, we have under a dozen. We actually have a lot of ordinances around small cells, much more than that, actually, that are much more protective than in the United States, like with setbacks of 1,500 feet or 500 feet, or in Ithaca, New York, they just passed one at 250 feet, 250 feet setback. The community members there thought that was, they wanted it to be changed to be more, but compared to Montgomery County, where we only have 30, it's quite impressive, actually. And we have, many countries that don't allow cell towers near schools, don't allow cell towers within certain feet of homes. In France, 60 mayors signed on to a petition to halt 5G. And here, there are countries with cell tower networks far more stringent than US FCC and ICNIRP. What you see here is the amount. This is looking at power flux density, but it's a part of the regulations involve looking at the power density kind of in the air. And US, Japan, and ICNIRP have limits. We allow the most radiation compared to some other countries, Russia, Israel, China, Turkey, Bulgaria. We have Belgium, Brussels here. Unfortunately, I didn't change the slide, they just changed their limits after heavy lobbying from industry. Their limits are not as loose as the United States, but they went up quite a significant amount after heavy, heavy lobbying. And then all of these other countries actually have radiation limits much more protective than the United States. You can go online to Environmental Health Trust to get some safety cards or some posters about how to reduce exposure to your phone. Don't put your phone near your head, don't put it near your body. Keep it out of your pants pocket. And also how to hardwire your computer. And should show you this too. There are many teacher and educational organizations that have addressed this issue. And if you are in a school, if you're a parent, if you're a teacher or an administrator, the United Educators of San Francisco passed a resolution asking for the California cell phone advisory to be in every classroom, to be disseminated to parents and teachers. The New Jersey Education Association has recommendations on how to minimize the health risks from wireless radiation. The United Federation of Teachers posts Dr. Moskowitz's Reducing Exposure to Wireless and the Baby Safe Project information to protect pregnant women. The Canadian Teachers Federation did a briefing document on Wi-Fi in schools, recommending limiting Wi-Fi in schools. The Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association as well. The New York State United Teachers has a resolution on the hazards of wireless radiation emissions, and best practices were developed for the union actually on using wired connections rather than Wi-Fi. And it goes on and on. A lot of this is on our website under wireless Wi-Fi in schools. We have a toolkit for Wi-Fi in schools. So, okay. I meant to mention this, yes, about birds, bees, and trees. Thank you for that. So there is no, the limits that we have are not for birds, bees, or trees, flora, fauna, or just for humans. So a lot of times when cell towers are proposed, they talk about the radiation on the ground, that it meets FCC limits, but nobody's looking at near the airspace, near the cell tower. That airspace is habitat where birds fly, insects fly. And the latest, there's a 3-part review by Blake Levitt, Dr. Henry Lai, and Albert Manville, former US Fish and Wildlife Service expert, lead biologist actually, on harm from telecommunications towers to birds. And they published a 3-part review with over 1,200 citations, going over the science showing increasing radiation from wireless networks, showing impacts, including changes to orientation, migration, food finding, effects on reproduction, mating, nest and den building, territorial maintenance and defense, longevity and survivorship, cyto and genotoxic effects have been observed. And they talk about that airspace as habitat, that it needs to be regulated as habitat. They talk about the rising electromagnetic fields as a novel form of pollution, and that there need to be rules by regulatory agencies to address this as a pollutant, that regulations need to be triggered to protect wildlife. Very, very important 3-part study on this issue. And actually, let me put into the chat. I want to put a link to all of this so that you can, okay, I'm putting in the chat links on our website where you can access the science and the studies and really bookmark that. These are studies since 2019, and the Blake Levitt, who's an award-winning writer, Henry Lai, who did research on genotoxicity. He actually did research years ago showing genetic damage in animals from wireless radiation. And his science was war gamed. He was attacked in his at the university, and it's a long story. You can look up Dr. Henry Lai and war gaming the science to learn more about that. So if you have any more questions, put them in the chat, please. Again, you can go to our website to find out more. Please sign up for our newsletter. Please also go to, MoCo SafeG. Wait, I had my slide. There's several groups in Montgomery County. MoCo SafeG has a website. There's a coalition site, which I need to get you the link for. And MC4T as well is another one. Let me get you the link to the Montgomery County. There's also the MoCo Coalition, mococoalition.blogspot.com. I'll put that in the chat where you can learn about the other groups and also access at the Take Action tab. You can go to the Action Network link. Let me actually share this page with you so I can show it to you. Oops. Okay, so just so you can see what I have here. So if you go to mococoalition.blogspot.com, there are several groups. There's the MoCo SafeG website. There's the TechWise Montgomery County. It's actually TechWise. It used to be TechWise Tacoma Park. That site has a lot of resources. There's the Montgomery County Coalition for the Control of Cell Towers, MC4T. There's small cells in Montgomery County as well. And if you go to the Take Action tab, that goes right to the Action Network, and you can just fill in your name, your email, your address. We'll be able to connect with you, and also you can send a letter to the council. They need to hear from us. It ain't over till it's over, and these antennas are going to start to be going up. The Montgomery County lawyer said 9,000 are expected, so we're just at the beginning. And people, I had a meeting this morning actually with another group, and they're starting to realize what's going on and see these antennas right outside their window. This woman who lives in Potomac didn't realize that that was an antenna right in front of the land that she just bought to build her home for her family. And as people learn about this, people are going to get more organized, and we fully believe we're going to be able to fix this in the county. There's also a YouTube channel with videos to just see this is from our press conference in Montgomery County. And there's just a lot on here if you want to learn about this issue and what's gone on. So please connect with us and sign up with the groups, MoCo SafeG and TechWise Montgomery County. And that way you can be connected on this issue. And I'm glad to answer any more questions. I'm also glad to meet with your group and answer questions about the lawsuit and the next steps and what communities can do. Many hands make light work, and we can and will fix this. This is not an unfixable situation. There have been a lot of environmental issues that seem unfixable and seem everywhere, and like there's just so much money on the other side. That's the way it is. But there is no choice but to fix this. And just like with cars that got seatbelts, our technology can be safer and can be safe. So thank you so much. Again, Theodora Scarrato. You can go to EH Trust ehtrust.org to learn more. Thank you.